Can people see my screen?
Yes.
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 Yep.
Perfect. Okay, I think I might better put on my headset. So that way I will not create echo in the recording.
All right. So without further ado, let's get started. Hey, Neela, welcome. So as usual, we'll start with agenda bashing. The main topic for today's conversation is going to be showing you a bunch of commands and things that you can do with SuzieQ that I believe are not for many of the SuzieQ users. And I say this because I had a bunch of users ask me questions only to realize that they don't know. And some of them are even older users. 1 second, someone's slacking me. Anyway, so coming back, that's what is the main agenda of the topic for the day. We'll have upcoming release 0.19.2. It's been upcoming for a few days simply because I was waiting for a couple of people who have filed bugs to make to tell me that it's been fixed. And then if there are any other community questions or feedback, I'm happy to take those and conclude the meeting.
Dinesh, I don't know if we'll have time or if there's interest, but one of the things that I was sort of wrestling with was REST versus the Python module.
Oh, good question, Claudia. Let me make a note of that and make sure that I address that.
If you have time.
Yeah, no, I will make sure I have time for this kind of stuff because this is a community-led meeting. So I want to make sure that I answer the community questions for sure. Okay. Do any of the others who are new, Florian, Theodore, any of you have any other questions? Andrea, do you have any questions that you specifically want answered?
No, not on my side. Thanks, Dinesh.
No, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. All right, then. With that said, then let's just get started right away with the command. So I'm going to go directly into demo mode and do everything over the command line. So there is not much slideshows to show. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And the fonts are good for everyone?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So without further ado, let's get started. So the one thing I did want to show before we continue is in this topology, what I'm going to be showing, everything is structured around this topology. Basically, 2-spine, 4-leaf, which are dual attached via MLAG, and 4 servers, an exit leaf connected to a firewall connected to the internet. So this is the topology of pretty much everything that I'll be showing during the demo today. So if you have any questions, it should be pretty easy. I'll leave this on for another minute for you all to see. Okay, with that said, let's get started. So the first command that, in case people don't know what's going on, you're starting for the first time, is namespace show. This basically shows what are all the namespaces you have in your network, and basically when was the last time anything on that network was updated. So if you take a look here, you see that one of them was updated, or many of them were updated only on 2022-07. They were not updated anytime soon. So this will help you take a quick look and say like, oh, I know what's going on. This is something that's old. Actually, I have to change this. This is not the right one that I want. It's this one. And you should see today's something from today. Yes, there it is. Okay, so with this said, let's get started. So you saw the namespace show. What I wanted to do was first show you some basic things, such as the fact that you can use regular expression in your searches. So you can do something like device show, or rather device show, and you can say hostname equals everything. And this follows the Python syntax for regular expressions, which is pretty similar to everything else. But if you are using regular expressions, the first thing you do is you put a this squiggly sign, which indicates that it is one other thing I want to do, rm minus rf tilde dot SuzieQ history. Okay. So if I do device show, and then I say namespace equals here, what I can do is specify just a specific set of names. So if I look at namespace show, I see no one else is joining. Okay. I see that there are these. So I can just say device show namespace equals tiddly dot star hyphen find. So this will only show you everything in the namespace that ends with find. And you will see that everything that is shown here is only with find, nothing else. The same thing you can do is you can reduce it for host names. You can say device show namespace equals nxos find, and you can say host name equals squiggly again leaf dot star, and you'll only see leaves at this point. So you can use the squiggly sign to do that. You can also use the squiggly sign with a not in front of it to indicate I want to see everything but. So now you should see everything but anything that starts with leaf dot star. The not applies to everything that is not just for regular expressions. So you can say something like not leaf 01 as an example, and you'll get everything but leaf 01. Or you can say not leaf 01, not leaf 02, and you'll get everything but not leaf 1 and leaf 2. You can use the not sign for pretty much any command. So for example, you can say interface show mtu equals not 1500. And it's not obvious to a bunch of people that you use this format of, sorry, one more person is trying to join, admit. It may not be obvious to everyone that you can use something like equal to not. So this is just the format of a keyword command model. So you type interface show mtu is not, and just to kind of keep this small, I'll just reduce it to a smaller subset of things, and you'll see that you get all the interfaces whose mtu is not 1500. You can also say something like, for example, I want it to be greater than 1500, but less than 2000. This is treated as a greater than, as an and statement, even though everything else in SuzieQ, when you type multiple options, are for. So this means show me everything that's an MTU that's greater than 1500 and less than 2000. So if you type that, you will only see those interfaces that are within that limit. Greater than or equal to works in a similar fashion, so there's no change to that. You can use that as well. So that's the first thing I want to point out, the fact that you can use all of these operations across various different things. So things like greater than does not work for anything but a numeric operator, but the not works for all operators, and the regular expressions obviously work only for strings. The regular expressions are supported only for host names and namespaces. So you will have to use them only for those two. For all the others, you get a bunch of, all the other options are supported. Was there a question?
So Dinesh, so, and I'm not very good with regular expressions, but would something like find $, right, sort of ends with, or caret,
Yes, they
would
all
that
work.
work?
Yes, that works. So you could do the same thing. For example, if you want to start, let's assume that you want to look at everything that ends with 01. So you would say something like device show namespace equals, let's, for the sake of discussion, change it and say host name equals tilde dot star 01 $. This means that I expect it to end with .1. Now you should see spine 01, leaf 01, and exit 01 in this case, and probably DC edge 01. And you'll see that that's exactly what you see.
Very nice. Yep.
Okay. Same thing with leaf. You can use something like leaf, and you will get everything that starts with that. So you can use complex regular expressions here, and they work. Okay. So we talked about greater than, less than, we talked about not, we talked about regular expressions. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was some simple things that you can do to look at the various options. So let's take a simple example. Suppose I say device summarize, and I say namespace equals EOS find, just for the sake of discussion. You see, it shows here that there are these 3 dots, and you're like, hey, I want to see more than that. I don't want those 3 dots. How do I see more than that? We have something called set call width. You can set call width equals 120. This changes the width, the maximum width of a column to 120. And if you type that, now you see the whole thing. Another example, you can say route show namespace equals EOS find, or let's do DC1. And you get this, and you say like there are 342 rows, but you get these dots in between. I would like to see everything if possible. Why are you restricting me to see only 342 devices? Now, from my perspective, and maybe this is where I'm not exactly a network operator, I don't like to see more than a handful of things on the screen, because eyeballing more than a screen full is actually too much. But there are situations, Andrea has complained several times to me about why he would want to see this. And I see the logic in wanting to have that. So if you want to support that, what you simply do is you say set max rows equals 0. It's a kind of unintuitive, but basically 0 means ignore it. And then you can say a route show, and you will get everything.
Andrea, thank you.
Yeah, but no problem, Claudia. But to me, the other quote unquote complaint is, why can't we paginate it? Why
Yes.
can't I get the first 100 and then
No.
100 and then 100?
So Andrea, thank you.
Oh,
There
yes.
it is.
Look
So
at
you see,
that.
I had paid Andrea before this call to make sure that I get he asks all the right questions. You can do that, and you get this where you can hit enter to continue. You get pagination.
Look at this. Oh, now I know, Dinesh. I'm going through Andrea.
Yeah. And then I let Claudia ask, but maybe this should be like default behavior.
Yes, that can be made easy. Again, so these are all things that to me, I don't have a religion on. People can say it. Now I don't have a large data set to show you, but let's assume for the sake of discussion that you've got 80,000 rows. Displaying 80,000 rows takes time. And the way the CLI in the open source works is you don't have streaming, which means all 80,000 rows have to be fetched and then displayed. So you're going to see a slowdown if you attempt to do a lot of display. But it is something you can do. And if you want that, the pagination to be the default behavior, all rows to be shown as the default behavior, happy to take care of that, Andrea. I mean, I think this is a discussion that would be much better suited for the channel. So if some of you can start that, we can have the discussion on the channel to make sure everybody is on the same page, and we can add that. Another option we can think of also, yeah, that's what I would probably do. In the enterprise edition, you can offer more complex configuration, but for I think the open source, at least making that the default should be not a problem if everybody wants it.
And of course, Dinesh, if a point could be made that if you get so many rows, probably you should start adding a filter to get less, right?
Exactly. That's been my approach. So that's why I never even thought of all the rows, never thought about a bunch of other things. But there have been many times, Andrea, where you convinced me that I want to see more, and here is why. And so rather than argue with you anymore, I said, let's just do it and be done with it. But more importantly, you had good reasons that there are corner cases where looking at everything might be what you're trying to do. Now, some people want to do that because they're looking for a particular prefix and they don't know exactly what they're looking for. And so they're trying to scan that. But sometimes you want to do it, but there is nothing like a grep that you would like, because the only filters you have are the filters that I provide via this. So for example, let's take, I did route. Let's take route for a second. And I don't believe there's anything in this that gives you that option. But let's assume that today, so for people who are not familiar with the CLI, you see that the CLI has all the options that you can type in right there. So you can use various choices. to do various things. So let's say I want to only see routes that have a prefix length of 24, and you will get only prefix lengths that are 24 in this. So you've got all of these choices. But suppose for a second, I didn't really offer the ability to look at certain things. Like, for example, you can also say, I want to see everything that's protocol BGP, right? And you get all the BGP set up. What you could do instead, if you don't have an option, is then this is where you will turn into, what's the word for it? A bit of a pandas ninja. You can use this query string, which is present across pretty much every command. And for all of the columns that are present, you can just type query string. And for this case, for example, if I did not provide protocol, you would simply type protocol equal BGP, and you will get the exact same behavior. Now, this could be for a field that I don't offer a filter on. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And Dinesh, one more thing, because I don't know if everybody knows about it, but I think it's good. You can run the command on the poller without being inside the poller. So if you need to do any manipulation of
Not
the
poller, the analyzer,
command
the CLI,
output,
you mean?
Yes. So if you need to be, if you need to do any manipulation of the command output using a Linux tool,
Yeah.
like you can
This is
just
what
do,
Andrea is talking about. Yeah.
yeah, you can just do SQCLI, blah, 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 and you can do that. So obviously it's not interactive, it's just, that command, but then you can pipe or whatever operator you want to do with the Linux environment underneath.
Yeah. So in this particular case, it didn't show. I don't know why, but grep leaf01 didn't work in this particular situation. But I suspect that's because of the format that it is coming out as.
Probably you're missing the quotes.
I don't think so. Grep shouldn't require quotes, but let's try it. No, I don't think it's quotes. The main thing, I think the reason why it says is because the format it's getting printed in is a, what's the word for it? Pandas data frame format. It's not a text. So I suspect grep is unable to look at it for some reason. So one way to fix that, and Andrea had this other question. Let's kind of go back and continue this for a second. So if you do this, you see these dots in between here. And one of Andrea's other complaints was, hey, Dinesh, these dots, can I get rid of them? Now, that is a little harder to do because pandas, this is built into pandas directly. And if I attempt to play with it, it does not let me play with it without really changing certain things. But one thing you can do, I believe actually I can change this particular behavior. But what you can do for right now is use this and say format equals markdown. If you do format equals markdown, it explodes the entire command sequence and you can see everything. Obviously, the display is not going to look very nice because it wraps across the entire space. But you can choose to do it this way. And I believe, Florian, if I do it that way, device show minus minus. So the moment you get into the Linux mode, you have to start using minus minus. Format equals, and you'd lose all the completion, etc. You can say this, and I believe if I do grep leaf01, I will see it now. There you go. Okay.
Dinesh, maybe another thing that you can show is that with the column filter, you can get rid of these dots as well.
Yes, I will talk. I was just going there, Luca. Thank you for pointing that out. So the other thing you can do exactly as Luca said is when you do this and you don't want to use markdown, but you want to see certain things, you can obviously select what columns you want to see. You can say simply something like, I know the namespace, so I don't care about the namespace. What I want to do is I want to see the host name. I want to see the prefix. I want to see the prefix length. I want to see the outgoing interfaces, and I want to see the protocol. I don't care about anything else. And you can do that, and you would get just that as your output. Now, someone might say, that's great, but how do I know what the heck am I supposed to type for the column names? I don't know the column names. Well, that's precisely why we have what is called the describe verb, which tells you everything you want to know about what are all the fields, what are the values associated with them. You know, is it a string? Is it shown by default? Is it part of what we consider the key? And what's the description associated with it? The other thing you can do is, like right now I'm typing route describe. So I was typing, if you notice, route, and I said show, and I said namespace equals DC1 every time. You don't have to do that. You can set everything to the context of that namespace by just using set namespace equals DC1. And if you notice at the bottom, it changes the context of the namespace. Now, everything I do is in the context of that namespace only. So if I do this route show, and if I simply say prefix len equals 24, the output now is only DC1. There is no other DC1. You can further restrict it, and you can say set hostname equals exit01. So now it will be DC01 namespace, exit01 hostname. And if I do this, I only see that. You can always override it for a specific command by providing additional options, like saying exit02. Now you'll only see exit02. So we will override the specific, but without anything else, we always have the option of setting the context. So you will only see things within that context. Okay. Any questions about these things? I presume this was all been useful and that it was not obvious to a lot of people what needed to be done.
Very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question. Can we use the same thing with the REST API?
What do you mean the same thing with the REST API?
Like getting data with prefix len, using regex or something like that?
Yes, regex are supported. All of those things that I'm typing here are supported in the REST API as well. Absolutely.
Okay.
So you can use the REST API and use wherever I used regex, less than, greater than, all of that stuff can be used in the REST API as well. Obviously, some of the characters, do you have to quote it in your query string, or will I convert it? I don't remember, but that's something to remember.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but all of those are supported in REST API. Pretty much everything I show you in the CLI is supported in the REST API. And if it's not, it's a bug, and you need to tell me about it. Tell us about it, we'll fix it. Okay. Okay, so moving back into this format, the next thing I wanted to do here was show you, okay, I have gathered the data, but I don't know what data has been gathered, and I don't know if everything is working. So if you want to check if something is working or not, if the poller is working or not, what you do is you use the SQPoller show, and you set the namespace, and you say this, and you will see you see a whole bunch of different options. So you see here a bunch of columns which are actually hidden now, but there is a write queue size, which is we are trying to write to the writer. There's a separate process running, which is a writer, which is writing to the database. If that writer queue becomes too long, we will start to see problems. So you can see this value, which shows in every time you see an array of 3 numbers, it represents the minimum, the maximum, and the median. Not the average, median. Same thing with node queue size is when I'm making a request to each of the nodes to go fetch data, how long was the queue? So if you take a look at this particular thing, it says that the queue was as long as 10, because there were 10 10 commands queued up before it got executed on an average. And then the RX bytes tells you how many bytes were received for each of those different commands. In this particular case, you can see it's 0, which means nothing was received. And there's a reason for that. Box never got anything. It never got polled. If you look at somebody else for device, you can see how long it took. I mean, the bytes that were taken. And if the amount of data that's being pulled is different, for example, in the case of interfaces, you can see that the average changes. All of this information is useful for us to understand and troubleshoot what is going on with the poller. The poll exceed period count is something that tells you, is the polling interval getting so long? I mean, is the data retrieval taking so long that we are exceeding the polling period? One of the things that we do in this particular situation is we take into account. So if you set a period of say a minute, we don't fire a new command to get the data every minute. If it takes 3 minutes to get the data, we wait for 3 minutes to get the data, and then we fire the next command only after a minute is up. We also set the timeout to be about the same size as roughly the same size as the polling period. So if it's taking too long, we do stop the command from running for long. But let's say that you have set the polling interval to 5 minutes and it takes 4 minutes to finish the command. We won't fire the next command until 5 minutes after the 4 minutes is up. So it doesn't fire at the 5th minute. It won't be a minute after the command is finished. It will be actually 5 minutes after the command has finished. This allows us to be a little more adaptive in how we deal with the device load, because we don't want to overload the device if we can help it. A bunch of people will tell you that some of the older devices, and Junos is particularly bad about this, unfortunately. It's good about a whole bunch of things, but it is particularly bad about really taking a very long time to retrieve data, especially routes data. And as a consequence, it can actually start running into various kinds of problems. That's not true of all Junos versions. It's particularly true of the MX, the older QFXs, and even the newer QFX 10Ks. So all of this information will help us figure out, is something going on with the network, with the poller, that is a problem. As always, you can say, if you want to see only the ones that failed, you can say status equals fail. And then you'll only see the ones that failed. You won't see everything. One of the complaints that is there, and it's been a long-standing complaint, is, hey, I don't know what these numbers mean. These status codes are meaningless to me. Can you put in some words, please? That's something that we are working on. We'll work on getting that to you guys. But that's something that's to be done. We also, as you see in this particular output, we also show you how long it takes to gather the data. So these are all things that help you look at your information, figure out what is going on, but also us. The next thing you can do is use this command called table and type table show and namespace DC1. So when you type this, this tells you all the tables for which we have gathered the data, the first time we gathered the data, and the latest time we gathered the data, how many different intervals are there, meaning how many different times we have gathered it, and how many devices are present for each of them. As you can see, some commands like EVPN is not on all devices because it's not enabled on all devices. These two commands will help you at the very start to look at whether things are working correctly with your poller and what it's gathering. If something seems off, this is one place to go take a look at to make sure everything is there. For example, let's assume that SuzieQ's OSPF parser is failing. As a consequence, you're not gathering any OSPF data. These two will be completely blank. So there will be no OSPF interface or OSPF neighbor. Or if it is present and it is failing on 4 of them, you will see that the number of devices it's gathering on is less than it needs to be. And then that's a sign to you that something is wrong and that you need to go take a look at the log to figure out what is going on. Any questions on what I have shown here? The one caveat with table show is if you have been gathering data for a year, for a month, 2 months, it takes a very long time in the current installation to load all of the data. So sometimes you can just run out of memory and the CLI can crash if the amount of data you have is a lot. So you want to be careful when you use table show. So table show is great for when you started, when everything is working, to check everything is working. We are going to fix it to make sure that it works even when the amount of data you have is a lot. But for now, you don't get that information. Meaning, if the amount of data you have is a lot, what ends up happening is it ends up crashing rather than showing you the data. In the enterprise, it will be fixed sooner, but in the open source, we'll eventually fix it too. Any questions? Okay, so having gone past what are some of the things I can do with the CLI, how do I troubleshoot what is going on when the box, when I first start using SuzieQ to verify that all the tables are being gathered, etc. The next thing that we can do is take a look at some of the commands and options and see how they are used. One of the commands, and when I was at Cisco, there was this person, Prem Jain, who I think many of you know as the P of the MPLS fame. He used to have this thing which said that if I haven't gotten a bug, then that feature is probably not being used. I have not gotten a single bug about topology, and so I feel like probably people don't know about topology, and so we should talk about it. So with that said, I thought I will show you what topology looks like. So basically, topology is a way to get the graph of your network in a tabular format to see how your network is connected. But rather than just show you the physical connections, we also allow you to see logical connections, and we'll see what those are during the course of this. So the basic model is you say topology show, and you give it a namespace, and what you do is you get an output that looks like this. Basically, you get all of the different fields, and you see at the top here in the columns what all we are doing. We are trying to validate whether this peering exists on LLDP. We are trying to validate if there is a ASN peering, what the ASN peering is, and what the ASN numbers are. Of course, we validate whether it's BGP it's connected via BGP or not. And if it's connected via OSPF, this will be true, and what the area is. And polled is an indication that we are polling the peer. So if we are talking to a device whose peer we don't know, this is one way for you to find out, for example, that there are devices in your network that are not in the SuzieQ poller, and is this a problem? So we look at various protocols and we show you what is going on over here. So to show you this further, if I take a different namespace and then say polled equals false, you will see that in this particular case, I just pulled out all information about exit 02. And so essentially exit 02 in this particular case is not polled. So we don't have any information about exit 02. So if you type device show namespace equals DC1 less, you will see that exit 02 does not exist here. So this is a very quick way for you to figure out, are there devices in my network that I don't know about that should be under SuzieQ's poll, but is not being polled? Some of the devices that are there may be things that you actually don't want polled, which is fine, but this is a quick way to catch that problem. Any comments, thoughts on this?
Well, to confirm your theory, I didn't realize this was here either. I thought this was only a capability in the enterprise version.
No, I put topology in the open source as well. The enterprise has got visualized display. The enterprise allows you to also see this output in a completely different format, etc., etc. But in general, the topology capability is there in the open source as well. Now, this topology show that I showed you was basically the model with no commands being typed. What you can do instead is you can say, I want to see the topology for BGP. And you'll see the topology for BGP. You can say, okay, this topology looks nice. Now, if I have built an EVPN fabric using, say, OSPF over IBGP, I expect to not have IPv4 unicast address family typically exchanging routes over the fabric. There should only be L2 VPN, EVPN, because OSPF, or if you're using ISIS, then ISIS is your underlying protocol for the default fabric. So there should be no underlay routes exchange, which is the IPv4 routes exchange in BGP. So how can you do that? You can do the same thing, but you can say, I want the AFI-SAFI to be IPv4 unicast. You should not see any leaf or spine in here. And you notice, okay, there are no leaves or spines. So this looks like I'm doing the right thing. You can also say, instead of doing all of this, I want to look at an ASN and I want to look at the topology only from the perspective of, say, this ASN. You didn't get that. I think there was a bug filed on this. Maybe that's why it's not working. Yeah. But you should get, with the ASN, you should be able to see the output as well. And you can reduce it and see things from an ASN perspective. Luca, can you make a note? Sorry, Usai, can you make a note of this? We'll need to go fix this as well. Thank you. So you can, of course, then see the topology from the perspective of OSPF. And you will see now the topology from an OSPF perspective, which will typically be only leaves and spines. There will be exit too because it's connected to, but there will be no internet edge, as an example. Now you say like, okay, but this is a lot of output. How am I supposed to eyeball anything? So one of the commands that we have in SuzieQ is this command called unique. So what you can do is you can say topology unique, columns equals hostname, and via equals OSPF. And now you will only see the list of host names which are present in that. And this included all namespaces, so I can reduce the namespace and I would get exactly what I see. So you can use unique for pretty much any column that is displayed to you. As an example, you can do, we'll do unique a little later. Let's continue with topology for a second. Any questions on topology, how you use it, and what is done with it? So the other thing that every command has is something called a summarize. SuzieQ's, one of the things that we have tried very hard to do with SuzieQ is to not have you as a user be confused about what is being done in order to see, get the information. In other words, if you are trying to have to call a lot of information, put together a lot of information and figure out things for yourself cognitively, the load on trying to do that is high, we want to reduce it. So as a simple example, columns is one way. So rather than looking at a whole bunch of outputs and then trying to figure out the uniqueness yourself, we just use unique to be able to do that. But another thing you can do is you can say topology summarize. And you'll get a bunch of different outputs which topology summarize. You get what is called a central node, which is what are the central nodes in this. Those are the nodes which have the most connectivity in the network. You get something called, is it fully connected? So if you have got a disconnected network, then it'll not show you all the things that are disconnected. I'm sorry, it'll show you that this is false, meaning that your network has got a bunch of disconnections. And the number of disjoint sets tells you how many different broken or partitioned networks you have. You also have this thing called self loop, which tells you if you have created a loop by forcing an entry back to yourself, you will catch that as well. In one of the customer networks, we use this to be able to point out to them that they had a misconfiguration in their BGP because they had screwed up some things. Not the BGP, in LLDP, sorry. Any questions on any of this? All right, so with that done, you can of course run topology summarize with a specific host, then you will see only with respect to that specific host. You can run all your filters as usual. So if I type, for example, VI equals BGP, you'll only get BGP information. Okay. So what I wanted to do next was talk about summaries. So summarize is a command that I think is phenomenally useful. And I wanted to walk through each one of them to show you what you can look at in each of the summaries to help you realize what is useful and what is not. And in the process of that, if people see something that you would like to see, but is missing as part of the summary, that would be helpful for me to know, because that again goes into the feature, the functionality that we can add to make this useful for you. So let's start with a simple one, which is address summarize. And if you type that, what you get is that there are 10 devices with IP addresses. So address is basically IP addresses. There are 678 addresses that are used across this network. The number of unique v4 addresses are 57. The number of unique MAC addresses are 527. And devices with v4 address count is 10. And devices with v6 address count is 0 in this particular case. And the subnets that are used are, these are the subnets. So there are 32, 24, 30, 31, and 2. And what are the top subnet counts? You have 44 of them in /32s, 21 of them with /24s, and 12 of them with /30s.
Dinesh, how would this work at the port level?
So
Could-
this is at the port level, meaning this is all the interfaces which have IP addresses on them.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
This is not the number of routes that are visible or not. This is the number of IP addresses that are used across interface. These are interface IP addresses.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
And you might say like, hey, why do you have 678 IP addresses, but only unique v4 address count is 57? That's because we are using, in this particular case, unnumbered interfaces. So we reuse the same IP address multiple times. Is there anything in here that you would like to see that you think would be helpful to you in a quick glance? Is this useful to you at all? Let's start with that. Any thoughts? Thomas, Florian, Theodore, Andrea? I'm calling out specifically simply to see if I would get any specific response. People sometimes are quieter in bigger calls.
Yes, it can be useful.
Okay. Is there anything specific that you think you would do with this? Is there anything that you think is missing, Florian?
Right now, I have not use case in mind.
Okay.
VRF.
VRF, good point. It's
You know,
actually in my notes. As I was doing this, I was sitting down and looking through it with a fine-tooth comb.
Yeah.
Nothing focuses the mind like a deadline or a demo, I guess. And I was able to look at this and I said, like, actually, I have a note here which says like WRF count is missing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then of course, you know, if there's something other than the default VRF distribution of the total subnets across the VRFs, that might be getting too detailed, but I think that could be
Subnet
very useful.
distribution across words. So the question there, Claudia, is really one of, you know, how much to show. It's not the fact whether I can or not. The question really becomes one of, is that too much information? And is that hard to gather? Because I'll show you some other ways where you can potentially get exactly that information. So let's take
the total VRFs, right? Defined.
Yes, the total VRFs you need. Let's leave that out of the equation. Absolutely. VRF count is missing. Total VRFs I'll add in. But to Claudia's point, if I wanted to dig deeper into any of this, and I wanted to find out how the subnet distribution is inside, what is the word for it? I guess subnet is not shown here. but inside a particular case, we can do that, and I'll show you how in a second. Let's do that with interface summarize. So when you run interface summarize, you see a bunch of things. And the first things you want to see is the if down count, and you want to see the if admin down count. If these two are off, you immediately know that something is off. In my particular case, the if down count is very high because NXOS, in the case of its VM, comes up with all the interfaces up and all the admin states up. But I don't have that, 64 port interfaces. I am not using all 64 ports. And so the if down count is very high. The other thing you can see here is how many unique MTUs exist. And so to Claudia's point, so there are 5 unique MTUs. Wow, I thought there were only 2. What are those 5 different interfaces or 5 different MTUs? So this is where you can type in unique. You can say columns equals MTU, and you get the list of different MTUs. So to your point, Claudia, we don't do subnet in address, but if we did, then you would use that unique to get the subnet distribution within a WRF. You would type address summarize WRF equals, and you would get the subnet distribution within that. And if you say like, okay, but I want to see the count of how many of them are there, you simply say count equals true, and you get how many entries exist for each of them. So there are 8 interfaces with 9,000 as the MTU, 8 interfaces with 65536 as the MTU, etc., etc., etc. And then, of course, if you want to go further and say, what are those interfaces? You can say interface show, namespace equals DC1, MTU equals 9,000. And you get all the interfaces which have 9,000 as the MTU. So this is the way you would use if you wanted to drill down further into what the summarize shows, how you would drill down. You would use unique, and after doing unique, you can go into show. The other thing you can do is here, if you see, we say if changes stat is 4. There have been 4. The maximum number of changes across for an interface has been 4. So what you can do is you can say interface stop. Namespace equals DC1, what equals number of changes. And if you type this, you will see which is the interface. You will get the list of interface, and you'll see which one is the one which has the maximum number of changes. So this is how you would take a look at what's going on in your network, from starting from a summary all the way down to a specific thing, whether it is a distribution of MTUs, it's what is the interface which has had these many changes that I want to see what's going on. Any questions or thought process on the usefulness of this or the lack of usefulness of this? Any feedback on the usability?
Oh, I think this is going to be, for some of the work I'm doing, very useful.
Cool. Good to hear. Okay. So this was, we did address and interface, but you can do the same thing across a bunch of other summarizations.
Janesh, sorry.
Yeah.
One quick question. Is this another way to get at, the thing I've been bugging you about, the I need to know the interfaces that haven't been used for 30 days?
Yes. So the way you would do that actually is not using top. But
Okay.
what you would do is you would basically say, you'd give it a start time, end time, and provide a state.
Okay.
And you would say the state is not connected. So
Okay.
again, in interface show, you can say state equals, and you will get these options, and you can say not connected.
Yep.
And then you can say provide the time window, and you can see whether any of these interfaces were not connected in that time.
Since you're going through this excellent material, by the way, when so you corrected me the other day because I was using quotes where I didn't need to use quotes. Is it just like special characters quote?
Yeah,
I
that's a
started
great
quoting.
question.
Okay.
That's a great question. So that's how shall I say, quirk of the framework that I use to build the CLI. Typically, you have to use a quote if you're using something like a full stop, like a period. So if you're using IP addresses, if you're using MAC addresses, then you have to use a quote. Otherwise, you don't need to use a quote.
Okay.
And the reason is the way this guy thinks about it. And now that I have taken over the CLI framework maintenance, I can go change it. Is when they see a period, when they see 172.17, they think it's a floating point number.
Yeah.
So I need to make them change. I need to go change that and say, just because you see a single dot, don't assume floating point. If you see more dots, assume it's a string actually. So then we can get rid of the quotes, but that's a change to the CLI framework. The other time you have to use, of course, is in specifying when you specify more than one value. Like, for example, we talked about, so let's take ARP&D summarize, or we'll come to ARP&D summarize in a second. So when we did interface summarize, if you were only interested in looking at the interface summary for leaf 1 and leaf 2, you can do that. You can just specify leaf 1, leaf 2. So when you specify multiple, that means there is a space in between them. You obviously have to put it in a quote.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and you get the output. And this output you can see is different from the output for not, I see this having come up. There. So you can see that the device count is only 2, whereas in the past it was for a lot more devices. And that's because I restricted myself to just these 2 hosts. So when you specify more than one host, you got to put it in quotes as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question, Claudia. So coming back to ARP&D summarize, even in ARP&D summarize, you got a bunch of things. And what we have again tried to do in the output is, because this has a lot of columns and you got to read all of them and they've got a lot of words in each one of them, we try and put the things that matter that you should pay attention to right away at the very bottom. So if you notice that in many of them, we will put the fails at the very bottom. So you can see if there were any failed entries, and if there were failed entries, if they were because of V4 or V6. Okay. So one of the things you can do this way is very quickly summarize, for example, in the case of protocols, what is going on. And if you do this, you will see a failed peer count here. And in this case, we didn't put it in the right spot. It's in the middle here, but a failed peer count that will tell you right away how many peers have failed. And this will help you go back and take a quick look and see what's going on. The other thing, and this was something that one of the users did, is they looked at the update RxTX to figure out that one of the update RXs and TXs were completely out of whack. And they realized that the reason it is out of whack is that they were having a problem with respect to the server that was connected to those 2 leaves, which was causing MAC address to flap all the time, which caused BGP advertisements to go up like crazy, because in an eVPN network, every time the MAC changes, a new BGP advertisement is sent. They did not know how to localize the fault. They used this information to go localize and figure out which was the node that was sending so much information, and therefore which was the node that was having this MAC flapping because of a misconfigured bond. It's a classic case. VMware, people don't want to pay money for the enterprise, so they use static bonds, and they had misconfigured it. Okay. And you can continue with this over and over again. You can take a look at a whole bunch of different information. And for example, if you look at eVPN summarize, you can see a bunch of things. We automatically figure out what is the eVPN mode it is running in. Is it running in symmetric mode or asymmetric mode? How many unique VTEPs are there? How many unique VNIs are there? How many L2 VNIs? How many L3 VNIs? Are we using multicast or are we using ingress replication? You get all of that information one shot here. And then we also have here how many remote VTEPs are present per VTEP. So how many remote VTEPs does a single VTEP see on average? So in this particular case, min, max, and median are the same, but in some other networks, it could be very different. So these are all ways in which you can look at your network, understand your network, ask questions of your network in terms of planning, in terms of thinking whether the design is right, what else is wrong, etc., etc.
I have one question. Can you hear me? Is there a way to see the distribution of the services across the devices in the namespace? For example, how many interfaces are up for each device inside the namespace and have a
yes. So let's kind of make sure I understand your question before I answer. You want to know, instead of taking a look at the output and trying to figure out, can I use the summarize to figure out how many interfaces are down for each host? Was that the question?
Yes.
So
no, for each host, how which is the value of a specific state, for example.
So the one thing, so right now we don't have a way to provide an output like how many interfaces are down, a count, so to speak, of failed state per host. That's something that will be in the enterprise. It's not here, but we will offer that. Here, the only way you would do that is you would type in, if I type interface summarize and I say namespace equals DC1 and I say host name equals LeFo1, then the down count here will be obviously only specific to this device. You would have to run this across each of the individual hosts to see all of them. The other way, of course, you can do is you can say interface show namespace equals DC1, state equals down or not up, to be more precise. This is an example where I need to put it in quotes. And you would get the list. You have 477, but again, this would not give you a count, which is what you're looking for. In the open source, there is no way to do that. But in the enterprise, there is. So does that answer your question, Theodore?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The other thing that we do is obviously path. Everybody is aware of path. And I want to kind of show you with path. Again, when I say path show, namespace equals, let's take an XOS find, source equals, 172.16.1.101, and destination is 172.16.2.201. You get an output which looks like this, and you're like, okay, this is a big output. I want to be able to summarize this path information. And here you can type summarize. That doesn't work. And what you get here is a quick summary, again, of what are the total paths, what is the per hop ECMP of the path, what's the maximum path length, what's the average path length, how many unique devices are hit during this process, what's the path MTU, whether we use an overlay through this. So this path is a combination of underlay plus overlay. I do the trace of underlay plus overlay. This path is constructed by looking at the routing table, MAC table, ARC table on every device rather than actually sending packets. And then if there are any MTU mismatches. So again, a very quick way for you to be able to look at and understand if something is wrong.
Dinesh, what would happen? So for one of my clients, they're using Checkpoint, and we don't have access to basically the ARP tables. What happens when there's an intermediate, jump where you don't actually, so SuzieQ doesn't have access to the ARP?
Today we stop at that particular device.
Okay.
In the enterprise, we'll add support for making it, to stitch two ends, right? You start from the source and you stitch it one way, then start from the destination, stitch it the other way, and see if you can meet in the middle somehow. We'll do more sophisticated algorithms that way. But in the open source, we just basically stop at the first disconnected point.
Gotcha. Okay.
Dennis, is this the same with the enterprise edition regarding the end hosts? If the end hosts are not polled, is the path provided from end to end, from one host to another?
Yes. So in this particular case, if you take a look at, for example, sorry, one second. Yeah. If you take a look at this namespace and you see there are no servers here. It's just leaf 1, leaf 2, leaf 3, spine 1, spine 2, exit 1, exit 2. There are no hosts here. I'm actually picking this information from the ARC table, finding the where is the ARC table entry that is local to this device, to that node, and from there starting the source and getting to the destination where the ARC entry is local. So you don't need to poll the endpoints at all for any of this.
But you can still run path.
Yes.
With an IP that is in fact an endpoint in the ARC table. Okay.
Yes. If it's in an EVPN network, it's not possible for me to know where a host, where an IP address could be, because the subnet is scattered everywhere. But it's possible for us to say, like, I don't know where this host's subnet is, but I mean, where it's whether the host is in my ARC table or not, but just assume, can you figure out from the subnet where it is and figure out what to do? We could do things like that.
Yeah.
And we plan to do those again in the enterprise to be able to help with all of that. Or to say, if there are multiple of them, take, for example, a virtual IP, which is essentially provided across multiple. In the case of virtual IP, the virtual IP is not really visible to you as an endpoint, but it is visible to you via the route table. So in all of those situations as well, how do you do paths? All of that will be handled much more in the enterprise than here, but we'll take care of that. And there also we can do things like specify the host name. So if you notice in here, I don't specify the host name, I don't specify the VRF. We figure out all of that information. If you notice here, we figured out the fact that it is coming in on EVPN VRF, then it goes to default, and then there is EVPN VRF again. All of this got figured out without you getting involved about specifying anything, but we could use those to narrow down. So if there is a virtual IP address that is present across multiple endpoints, we could say start from this host and assume that and run the trace. Or if you're running EVPN, where the subnet is distributed across many leaves, you can say assume this leaf as a starting point and this leaf as a destination point. And I don't care if it's not in the ARC table, just run the path.
Yeah.
The other thing, if there are no other questions here, the other thing, and there are lots of these things, you can use route summarize again to see all kinds of interesting things. You can see how many unique prefixes are there, how many unique VRFs are there, how many of them are interface routes, meaning /30/31. I call /30 and /31 interface routes. So how many interface routes are present? How many host routes are present? Those are /32s. Total v4 count, total v6 count, how many different routing protocols are used, how many different next stops are present, and how this is the routes per host stat again, where again, when you see 3 numbers, it's the minimum, the maximum, and the median. And the same thing with respect to routes per WRF. The other thing I show is there any device without a default route? And this is not classified or broken up into WRF, but if there are devices which have no default route, that could be an indication of a problem potentially. So we indicate that as well. We say that, yes, there are devices with no default routing. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to show, because people may not be aware of it, is in interface, we have something called port mode. Because it's not shown by default, you may not be aware of it. So you can say interface show namespace equals DC1, and you can say columns equals host name, IF name, and port mode. And port mode is essentially, is it an access port? Is it a trunk port? Is it a routed port? Or it's a port I don't know anything about? And you get this. So when it's unknown, it means like, I don't know anything about it. In this case, I could have marked it as loopback, but I don't. Management 0 is a routed port. We could again reduce this. And now here is an example where I do specify port mode equals access, and you get the list of all access ports. And you can leave out this information, I believe, and you will get that. If you just say port mode equals access, this should work. Okay. And of course, you have trunk as well. The last thing I wanted to show you was, if you look at Mac show, and I specify, I don't know if this will work with this particular command. I may have to look at the timestamps. But if I say Mac show namespace equals NXOS find, and I can specify a column, which is host name, MAC adder, VLAN, MAC adder, OIF, and what we call the move count. This tells you how many times a particular MAC address has moved in a given time window. So it doesn't work right now because all of the time window I look at by default is, what's the word for it? An hour. So if I say view equals all, you probably will get the MAC addresses. So you'll see here there are those MAC addresses which have changed more than once. Or you can do the opposite, which is, you can say, instead of doing it this way, you can say Mac top namespace equals NXOS find, and you can say what equals move count. And if you do this, you'll get the list of what are the MAC addresses that have moved the most, and what are the devices on which they have moved the most. And to me, the definition of a MAC move is either the remote VTEP changes or the outgoing interface changes. If either of those two things happen, then I flag that as a move. So you can also get move count. And here is the one way that you can actually use move count to quickly get to figuring out what MAC addresses have moved the most in your network. And if you specify a start time and an end time, you will be able to figure out in that start time and end time, which MAC addresses have moved the most.
But right now, it's got a 1 hour view. Is that
Yes,
correct?
by default, if you don't specify anything and you give it a move count, it uses an hour from now. So it basically runs every an hour back from now. It tries to see how many. But since these were taken in August, an hour from now gives you nothing. Which is why I use view equals all to be able to see it. But don't use view equals all if you've got data that's been running for several months, because then I'll go across every single entry that's been present, and that can run out of memory for you. Any questions on what has been seen so far?
Dinesh, and I don't know if you expose this or not, but obviously, sorry, you guys, my alarms are going off. I use the up arrow, right, in the command history
Yeah.
the time. In fact, I freak out when I think I've lost a command. I finally figured out how to put, is there a way to get to that file, to that history?
Yes, that history is in tilde.SuzieQ history. There.
Ah, I'm so happy.
By the way, you can also get to it by typing Mac, and if you hit Control R, you can get a search, reverse search.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So if there are no other questions, I thought I will answer Claudia's other question, which is what's the difference between using the REST API and the Python API? So from a REST API perspective, the difference between the REST API and the Python API is essentially the fact that the REST API allows you to use any language you want to be able to pull the information out. The REST API also, in the open source, there is no difference between the REST API and the Python API. It's just that the Python API will be faster because the REST API goes through a serialization, deserialization process between pandas data frame to data frame, trying to parse the REST API commands, etc. Whereas the Python will be obviously much faster because it's all just native. And the way the Python works is it's fairly simple. Again, from the perspective of trying to make everything as easy as possible, you say from SuzieQ.SQ objects, import get SQ object. Everything is an SQ object. And so you then basically say, if you want to see, for example, the device state, you say get SQ object, you say device. And if you are providing, start time, end time, you provide those, or you simply close that and you say get. And if you're providing a namespace, you say namespace equals DC1 and you get the output. That's it. If you have to specify columns, then you add columns here and you specify the columns. But otherwise, this is pretty much it. And if you want to do top, you can run top instead of get, you replace it with top and you use what equals the name of the column and you get what you want. The same thing with summarize. You just instead of get, you use summarize. And if you, for example, I presume if you do this interactively, it should work. If I say dobj equals get SQ object device, and then I type dobj dot, you should be able to get all the options that are available as functions. So you can use them to be able to look at what you want. And if you want to see what tables are there from SQ objects where we had get SQ object, if you want to import get tables, and then you run get tables, you get the list of all the tables that you can run. So the REST API allows you to be able to take a look. So what is missing from here? Again, let's go back to asking what is missing from here. The way it has been written is everything is a keyword argument. So if I take, for example, dobj.get and I hit a question mark, the only thing that it says is there are keyword arguments. Whereas REST will give you all the parameters listed out. So you can see what each parameter is, what is the type it is, etc., etc. Whereas you don't get all of those details from the Python API. Any questions?
No, this was helpful. Thank you. I guess I'm just curious. I've been pretty much solely focused on REST, but in Python, I don't even know why. I tend to gravitate towards the APIs I guess, just in
Yeah,
general.
makes sense.
So yeah, and it occurred to me the other day, there's I'm in Python, there's a
Yep.
module, maybe I made the wrong decision.
Yeah, you can always use Python. And again, we have tried to keep the Python. So everything, the CLI, the GUI, the REST API, all of them go through the Python API. So the behavior is going to be identical for you. You're not going to get a different behavior. The only things you will see are things like in the REST API, you will get the timestamp as a seconds from epoch. You'll get a timestamp. You won't get a human readable string. Whereas in the CLI and in the GUI, you will convert that into a human readable string. And if you are like, hey, I want to convert all of the things into a human readable string. So remember DOBJ, if you type this, one of the fields you have is humanize fields. So if you just call the object that with humanize, we will just humanize the values and return the data frame back to you.
Nice.
All the values. Yeah. But the basic idea is if anything is humanizable, that's to be left with the functions, the front ends that are doing the humanizing, like the CLI and the GUI. The API should be as fast as possible, as raw as possible. So it's much more machine friendly, but at the same time, if you want to call something to be able to do things, you can.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we're coming to almost to the top of the hour and the end of the session. Any questions? Has this been a useful session? And are there things like this that you would like to see more of in the future community meetups? If so, what are the kinds of things you would like to see would be helpful for me to know, because I can run them. I tended to make the community meetings about the community, meaning the users come on and they talk about their deployment issues, they talk about their problems or their situations, or they present what they are doing with the network. And a bunch of people have already done that. Claudia has done that. A bunch of others have done that. So I have not done anything like a tutorial typically, which like I did today. But if there are things you would like to see me do, please let me know. Then moving on to what is coming up in 0.19.2. It's a very minor fix. There are a bunch of fixes for Junos and iOS. One of them, Florian, was from you. There is also a bug in paths that has been fixed for VXLAN. Someone from Google sent a path fix. I don't know what they're doing with it, but I got that from a Google engineer. So that's what is coming in. So it's basically a minor bug fix release, and the next major release will be 0.20, which will come sometime the end of the year. This release should come out now. There may be a 0.19.3, which is basically just documentation updates. As part of the next enterprise release, I was looking at the documentation and I realized that the open source documentation is badly out of date. Some of the command outputs are, not even relevant anymore. So I need to go fix all of that. So there may be a version that puts out a better version of the output. Any other questions? If any of you are interested in hearing more about the enterprise, send me a private email. I'm happy to set up a time with you where we can go over the enterprise. All right, if there is nothing else, I will stop the recording.